What's unfolding around the federal election case involving Donald Trump is not just another headline, not just another courtroom argument, and not just another political controversy that disappears in a 24-hour news cycle. This case sits at the center of one of the most consequential legal and constitutional debates in modern American history because it touches on the core question of whether a former president can be held criminally responsible for actions taken in the final days of his time in power. The federal election case is built around allegations connected to the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election, and prosecutors argue that the events that followed were not simply political disagreements or rhetorical battles, but a coordinated effort to interfere with the lawful transfer of power. At the heart of the case are claims about false electors, pressure campaigns directed at state officials, and communications that prosecutors say were intended to disrupt the certification of electoral votes. The defense, on the other hand, insists that everything involved fell within the boundaries of political advocacy, legal strategy, and constitutionally protected speech. That clash of interpretations is exactly what makes this case so important, because it forces the courts to draw a line between aggressive political maneuvering and potential criminal conduct. And as this case moves through the legal system, the decisions made by judges could shape how future presidents and candidates behave when elections are contested. Now, before we go deeper, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because we're breaking down these complex legal battles in clear, straightforward language, and you don't want to miss the updates as this case unfolds. The federal election case includes multiple charges tied to alleged conspiracies to obstruct official proceedings, to defraud the United States, and to interfere with voting rights. Prosecutors argue that the alleged conduct was not just about challenging election results in court, but about creating alternative slates of electors and attempting to persuade officials to reject legitimate vote counts. The defense counters that challenging election results is a long-standing political practice, and that the actions described were part of a legal and political strategy rather than a criminal conspiracy. One of the central legal questions is the issue of presidential immunity. Trump's legal team has argued that a president should not face criminal charges for actions connected to official duties, even after leaving office. Prosecutors have pushed back, saying that no one is above the law and that the alleged actions were political in nature, not official presidential acts. Courts reviewing the case have been forced to examine historical precedents, constitutional text, and past Supreme Court decisions to determine whether immunity applies and, if so, how far it extends. That issue alone could reshape how presidential power is understood for generations. Another key factor in the case is timing. The legal process has been influenced by appeals, scheduling disputes, and questions about when the trial should begin. Each delay or acceleration carries political implications, especially in an election cycle, because the outcome of the case could intersect with campaign events, debates, and voter perceptions. Legal analysts have pointed out that the pace of the courts can sometimes matter just as much as the substance of the charges themselves. And that's why every procedural motion, every appeal, and every ruling is being watched closely by both legal experts and political strategists. The prosecution's strategy appears to focus on presenting a detailed timeline of communications, meetings, and actions that they argue show intent. They are expected to rely heavily on documents, witness testimony, and recorded statements. The defense, meanwhile, is likely to challenge the interpretation of those communications, arguing that political speech and legal advice are being mischaracterized as criminal acts. This sets up a trial that, if it proceeds, could hinge not just on what was said or done, but on how those actions are legally defined. And that distinction is where the real battle will take place, because the jury or the judges deciding pre-trial issues will have to weigh not just facts, but the constitutional principles behind them. The outcome could influence future elections, future prosecutions, and even the balance of power between the executive branch and the justice system. So as the federal election case continues to move forward, it's not just about one defendant, one indictment, or one courtroom. It's about the boundaries of presidential authority, the meaning of political accountability, and the legal standards that will guide the country through future electoral disputes. And as the next filings, rulings, and hearings unfold, the direction of this case could determine far more than a single verdict. It could redefine the relationship between power, law, and democracy itself. As the federal election case moves deeper into the legal system, the focus is shifting from the political headlines to the precise legal arguments that will determine what actually happens in court. At this stage, much of the action is not happening in front of a jury, but inside briefing rooms, appellate filings, and closed-door hearings where judges are deciding what evidence can be used, what claims can move forward, and how the Constitution applies to the charges. These pre-trial battles may not generate the same dramatic visuals as a courtroom showdown, but they are often where the most important decisions are made. In fact, legal experts frequently point out that complex federal cases are shaped long before opening statements ever begin, because the rules about evidence, immunity, and procedure can determine the entire direction of a trial. And that is exactly what is happening here. The defense strategy has centered on a set of constitutional arguments designed to narrow the scope of the case or eliminate it entirely. One of the key claims is that actions connected to election disputes fall within the realm of political speech and official responsibilities, and therefore cannot be treated as criminal conduct. This argument relies heavily on the idea that the presidency carries certain protections meant to preserve the independence of the executive branch. According to this view, allowing criminal prosecution for actions tied to official duties could create a dangerous precedent where political opponents use the justice system to target former presidents. Prosecutors, however, are taking the opposite position. They argue that the conduct described in the indictment was not an official act of governing, but rather an attempt to interfere with the electoral process for personal or political gain. Their filings emphasize that the Constitution does not provide blanket immunity for actions that violate federal law, and that the courts have long held that even high-ranking officials can be held accountable if they step outside the boundaries of their authority. This clash between immunity and accountability is likely to be one of the most important legal questions in the case, and it may ultimately be decided by the highest courts in the country. Another critical issue involves the scope of evidence that can be introduced. Prosecutors are expected to present communications between advisors, public statements, internal planning documents, and testimony from individuals who were involved in the events after the 2020 election. The defense is expected to challenge many of those materials, arguing that some are protected by executive privilege, attorney-client privilege, or constitutional protections for political speech. Each of these disputes requires careful judicial review, and every ruling has the potential to reshape the prosecution's timeline or weaken certain claims. These legal fights may sound technical, but they carry enormous consequences. If key pieces of evidence are excluded, the prosecution's narrative could be significantly limited. On the other hand, if the court allows a broad range of testimony and documents, the trial could present a detailed reconstruction of the events that followed the election. That is why both sides are investing so much time and effort into these pre-trial motions, because the outcome of those decisions may matter more than any single moment in the courtroom itself. Timing is also playing a major role. Federal courts operate on strict procedural schedules, but high-profile cases often encounter delays due to appeals and constitutional questions. Each time an issue is elevated to a higher court, the timeline shifts, sometimes by months. In a politically sensitive case, those shifts can have ripple effects across the broader political landscape, especially if key hearings or decisions occur close to major campaign milestones. Analysts across the political spectrum have noted that the legal calendar and the electoral calendar are now intertwined in ways rarely seen before. That intersection of law and politics is one of the defining features of this case. It is not just a legal dispute taking place in isolation. It is unfolding in real time in the public eye during a period of intense political competition. That combination increases the stakes for every decision, every filing, and every statement from the courtroom. And if you want to stay on top of each development without the noise and confusion of rumor-driven headlines, make sure you're subscribed, because we're breaking down the legal reality behind the political drama as it happens. Looking ahead, the next phases of the case will likely involve additional rulings on immunity, potential appeals, and decisions about when or whether a full trial will take place. The answers to those questions could shape not only this particular prosecution, but also the legal boundaries that apply to future presidents and candidates. That is why constitutional scholars, political strategists, and legal analysts are all watching the same docket, waiting to see how the courts define the limits of presidential power in a democratic system where elections, laws, and accountability all intersect. So as the federal election case continues to move forward, it's not just about one defendant, one indictment, or one courtroom. It's about the boundaries of presidential authority, the meaning of political accountability, and the legal standards that will guide the country through future electoral disputes. And as the next filings, rulings, and hearings unfold, the direction of this case could determine far more than a single verdict. It could redefine the relationship between power, law, and democracy itself. As the legal arguments continue to unfold in the federal election case involving Donald Trump, the final and perhaps most consequential phase centers on what could happen next and how the outcome might shape the political and legal landscape of the United States. At this point, the case is no longer just about motions and filings. It is about the broader implications of whatever decision the courts ultimately reach. Because once the key constitutional questions are resolved, the legal process moves into a stage where the facts, the testimony, and the evidence become the central focus. And that stage could have a lasting impact not only on this particular defendant, but on the boundaries of presidential power for decades to come. If the courts ultimately rule that former presidents do not have broad criminal immunity for actions tied to elections, the case would likely move toward a full trial. That trial would center on whether the conduct described by prosecutors meets the legal definitions of conspiracy, obstruction, or interference with federal processes. Jurors would be asked to examine communications, witness accounts, and timelines that reconstruct what happened after the 2020 election. The prosecution would attempt to demonstrate intent, arguing that the actions described were part of a coordinated effort to disrupt the lawful certification of electoral votes. The defense, in contrast, would likely focus on the argument that every action taken was rooted in political advocacy, legal advice, or constitutionally protected speech. That fundamental disagreement about intent and legality would become the heart of the trial. If the case proceeds to that stage, it could become one of the most closely watched trials in modern American history, not only because of the identity of the defendant, but because of the legal principles at stake. The proceedings would likely involve testimony from high-level officials, advisors, and individuals connected to the post-election efforts. It could also involve extensive documentary evidence, including emails, phone records, and internal communications that outline the decision-making process at the time. Each piece of evidence would be analyzed not just for what it shows, but for how it fits into the legal definitions that jurors would be instructed to apply. Another possibility, however, is that the courts could accept some form of immunity argument or impose limits on the scope of the charges. In that scenario, parts of the indictment could be narrowed, delayed, or dismissed, depending on how judges interpret constitutional protections for presidential conduct. That kind of ruling would not only affect this case, but could also establish new legal precedents that shape how future presidents are treated once they leave office. Constitutional scholars have already suggested that whatever the final rulings are, they will likely become part of the legal framework studied for generations. There is also the question of timing and political impact. Because the case is unfolding during a period of intense political activity, every legal development carries potential consequences beyond the courtroom. Court rulings, trial schedules, and major decisions could influence campaign narratives, media coverage, and voter perceptions. That does not change the legal standards that judges must apply, but it does increase the national attention surrounding every procedural step. And that attention means that even technical legal rulings can have immediate political effects. Throughout this process, the courts are being asked to balance several competing principles. On one hand, there is the idea that no individual, regardless of position, is above the law. On the other hand, there is the concern that prosecuting former presidents could create a cycle of politically motivated cases after every election. The challenge for the judiciary is to interpret the Constitution in a way that preserves both accountability and stability. That is not an easy task, and it is one reason why the legal questions in this case are being treated with such seriousness by the courts. If you want to follow how these decisions unfold and what they mean in practical terms, make sure you're subscribed, because the next rulings could reshape not only this case, but the legal standards that apply to the presidency itself. The coming months will likely bring additional motions, possible appeals, and further clarification from higher courts about the scope of presidential immunity and the boundaries of federal criminal law. Once those questions are settled, the path forward will become clearer. Either the case moves toward trial or it is narrowed or dismissed based on constitutional grounds. And whichever direction it takes, the outcome will stand as a landmark moment in the relationship between political power and the rule of law. Because at its core, this case is not just about past events. It is about defining the legal principles that will guide the country through future elections, future disputes, and future transitions of power. So as the federal election case continues to move forward, it's not just about one defendant, one indictment, or one courtroom. It's about the boundaries of presidential authority, the meaning of political accountability, and the legal standards that will guide the country through future electoral disputes. And as the next filings, rulings, and hearings unfold, the direction of this case could determine far more than a single verdict. It could redefine the relationship between power, law, and democracy itself. The final stage of the federal election case involving Donald Trump will likely be defined not just by courtroom arguments, but by the long-term consequences that follow whatever decision the courts ultimately reach. By the time the case reaches its decisive phase, the legal groundwork laid in earlier rulings will determine the scope of the charges, the admissibility of key evidence, and the constitutional boundaries that apply to a former president. At that point, the case transforms from a battle over legal theory into a direct examination of facts, intent, and responsibility. And that transformation is where the real weight of the case becomes clear. If a full trial ultimately proceeds, it would revolve around a central question: whether the actions taken after the 2020 election were part of legitimate political and legal advocacy, or whether they crossed into criminal conduct under federal law. Prosecutors would seek to establish a clear chain of events, showing how different efforts were connected, what goals they were meant to achieve, and how those efforts allegedly interfered with official government processes. They would rely on witness testimony, internal communications, and documented timelines to argue that the actions were not isolated or spontaneous, but part of a coordinated strategy. The defense, in response, would likely emphasize that political campaigns frequently challenge election outcomes, pursue legal remedies, and engage in aggressive advocacy. Their argument would focus on intent, asserting that the actions in question were rooted in a belief, whether correct or not, that the election results should be contested. From that perspective, they would claim the conduct falls within the boundaries of constitutionally protected political speech and legal strategy. This clash between competing narratives would shape the trial's outcome, because federal criminal cases often hinge on whether prosecutors can prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Even with extensive evidence, the interpretation of motives and purposes becomes the central issue. And in a case involving political actions, those interpretations become even more complex, because the line between political advocacy and unlawful interference is not always easy to define. Beyond the courtroom, the verdict, whatever it may be, would have immediate and lasting consequences. A conviction could reinforce the principle that former presidents can face criminal accountability for actions connected to elections. An acquittal or dismissal, on the other hand, could strengthen arguments about broad presidential protections and political speech. Either outcome would shape how future leaders, campaigns, and legal teams approach contested elections. The precedent set by this case could influence decisions made years or even decades from now. There is also the institutional impact to consider. Federal courts are not just deciding a single case. They are defining constitutional boundaries. Their rulings will be studied by scholars, cited in future cases, and potentially referenced in congressional debates about executive power. In that sense, the case becomes part of a much larger legal and political framework. It is not just a moment in the news cycle, but a chapter in the evolving interpretation of the Constitution. Another factor that could shape the final outcome is the possibility of appeals. High-profile federal cases often continue through multiple layers of the judicial system, especially when constitutional questions are involved. Even after a trial verdict, appeals could extend the legal process, with higher courts reviewing whether the trial was conducted fairly, whether evidence was properly admitted, and whether the legal standards were correctly applied. Those appellate decisions could further refine the constitutional principles at the center of the case. Throughout this process, public perception will continue to shift in response to each legal development. Court filings, rulings, and testimony often become major political talking points, influencing how different groups interpret the case. Yet the legal system operates on a different timeline and set of rules than the political arena. Judges and juries are bound by evidence, statutes, and constitutional interpretation, not by campaign narratives or media coverage. That distinction is essential to understanding how the case will ultimately be decided. If you want to stay informed as the final stages unfold, make sure you're subscribed, because the decisions ahead could define the legal limits of presidential power for a generation. The next rulings, the potential trial, and any appeals that follow will collectively determine how this historic case is remembered. And when historians look back at this period, they may see this case as a turning point, one that clarified how the law applies to the highest office in the country and how the balance between political authority and legal accountability is maintained. Because in the end, the federal election case is about more than any one individual or any single election. It is about the legal principles that govern the peaceful transfer of power, the responsibilities of those who hold public office, and the constitutional framework that ensures the rule of law remains stronger than any political moment. Either the case moves toward trial or it is narrowed or dismissed based on constitutional grounds. And whichever direction it takes, the outcome will stand as a landmark moment in the relationship between political power and the rule of law. Because at its core, this case is not just about past events. It is about defining the legal principles that will guide the country through future elections, future disputes, and future transitions of power. So as the federal election case continues to move forward, it's not just about one defendant, one indictment, or one courtroom. It's about the boundaries of presidential authority, the meaning of political accountability, and the legal standards that will guide the country through future electoral disputes. And as the next filings, rulings, and hearings unfold, the direction of this case could determine far more than a single verdict. It could redefine the relationship between power, law, and democracy itself.